Hello and welcome to the Love Reading Lit Fest. We are really excited to invite you to our event today with Kelly Barnhill, the author of this absolutely brilliant middle grade book called The Ogress and The Orphans. It's an absolute stunner. We are joined with Kelly today with one of our reading ambassadors, Frankie, who's age 10. And I'm going to hand over to Frankie shortly to ask Kelly her questions. But first, just let me tell you a little bit more about her. So Kelly Barnhill is joining us today from Minnesota, where she lives with her husband and her 3 children. She is the author of 4 children's novels, including The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which was awarded the Newbery Medal in 2017. The Witch's Boy, another one of her brilliant books, received 4-starred reviews and was a finalist at the Minnesota Book Awards. As well as writing for children, Kelly has got her first adult novel coming out later this year, and it's called When Women Were Dragons, and I, for one, cannot wait to read it. But we are here today, as I said, to talk about The Ogress and The Orphans. It's out now. It's published by Piccadilly Press. Love Reading for Kids has awarded it a star book, and Frankie and I couldn't agree more. Kelly, welcome to the Love Reading Lit Fest.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. Hello, everyone, and hello to Frankie. And I'm so pleased to be talking about books and imagination and why we tell stories and why we have all these other things that show up in this story. So I'm very pleased.
Absolutely. Oh no, it's great to have you here. We both, Frankie and I were just talking through her questions earlier, and we both adored this book. I gasped, I chuckled, and I marveled at the cleverness of it. It's so clever and so beautiful, and I'm sure it's going to win more awards for you. It certainly deserves to. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Frankie, and she's got some questions for you. So over to you, Frankie.
Awesome. Hi, Frankie.
My first question is, so this is a book about 15 orphans who live in a place called Stone in the Glen. Once upon a time, it was a very lovely town, but then the library burnt down and more fires destroyed the town. Then there was a sinkhole, crop fires and floods. I was sad as it sounded like such a magical place before. Where did you get the idea for the book from?
That's a really good question. I wrote this book by accident. I did not think I was going to write again. I had, as you said, I won the Newbery Medal for The Girl Who Drank the Moon, and I didn't expect to. I didn't think it sort of came out of nowhere for me. I was not really paying attention to any of the conversation around it at all, and so I had this sort of sense of imposter syndrome, and also a deep sense of I couldn't really imagine the utility of my own voice in the world, and at the same time, it just seemed like things were getting pretty mean in the world. The news was bad. I called my phone the rectangle of doom, and it seemed to me that this people in politics that were using division and nastiness and derision towards others, that it was not only getting worse, but it became a way of enlarging people's self, enlarging their stature, enlarging they're using it as a way of making money, and that was so icky to me. And I just thought, I don't know if I have anything more to say in the world as it is anymore. And I thought, well, I'll just take care of my family and that will be my job now. That is what I thought. But as things got worse and worse and worse, I kind of had to take care of my heart a little bit. And so I started writing fairy tales just for myself, not for anybody else. Every morning, I would write a fairy tale on scratch paper or old loose leaf paper. I would tell myself a story about siblings on a journey, or about a mad duke in a castle, or about people who lose sight of who they used to be, and their loved ones have to hold on to them very, very tightly so that they remember who they are again. Or the little old lady who's in the middle of the forest and you really want to give her your lunch, otherwise things will go bad for you, things like that. And I would write the story in the morning and I would read it out loud to my dog, and then I would throw it away. I mean, I would recycle it because I'm not a monster. Uh, and I did that every single day for a long time. And I had no intention of showing them to anybody or sharing them with anyone. But then I wrote a story that felt different. Um, and um, and that began and ended with a flock of crows about an ogress that lived on the margins of a town that had lost its way and lost its heart and had lost its mind. And about a family of orphans that also live on the razor's edge and deprivation, and how these two groups came together. These three groups really came together. And I think this idea of like a beautiful place that had lost its way, I mean, it felt like there were a lot of beautiful places that had lost its way, and a lot of beautiful places that had collectively lost its mind. Um, and and then that just got more so. Anyway, but I think that does happen again and again, you know. I do think that there have been other times when the beloved community becomes less so. So
Mm.
that's kind of where that comes from. That was a really good question, Frankie. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I read that this is an allegory book, but I didn't know what that meant. So can you tell us about it, please?
Sure, an allegory. I mean, so first of all, I should clarify. I did not write this to be an allegory, but I think that people read it as an allegory, and I think that sometimes writers accidentally write allegories. Okay, and so an allegory is usually a story that stands in for something else, right? And so, for example, when you were little, you probably read that nursery rhyme about Tom Thumb, stuck in his thumb and pulled out a plum, and you just that was just like a delightful rhyme to you, but at the time that was written, that was an allegory that was like talking about something that was happening in sort of the political world at the time. But of course, we don't remember that anymore. And of course, you probably read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when you were younger. Those books are all allegories too, about because C.S. Lewis was writing about his own faith, as well as about other things that he was sort of thinking about in the world. How all of those books are sort of allegories for something else. So the story is itself, but the story responds to sort of like bigger concepts in the world. So anyway, so I do think that this is somewhat of a political allegory, in that where we have the mayor who is breeding divisiveness, and who not only that is trying to enrich himself off of other people's pain. But honestly, I was thinking about this recently because my dog found the toy. Oh no, it's okay. We're gonna ignore her. We so in all of this stuff that's happening in the world right now with all these sort of wars and all of these other things, you've probably heard the word kleptocrat before, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, you've heard that word, and it's a terrible thing that happens in the world, and we all know about it. But I was thinking about it because I was thinking about how, like, long, long, long ago, when people were first writing stories about dragons, right? And the people who were telling those stories about dragons were all living in this very feudalistic world, right? Where all of the people who were working every day, all of their labor, all of their work, all of the things that they grew from the ground, the things that they made for their hand, all of the value of that was taken away from them and was gathered together by the lord in the castle, right? So the people are doing the work and everything gets pulled away, siphoned away. And you've got somebody who's just taking and taking and taking, right? And I thought, no wonder they came up with this idea of dragons, right? Dragons who just hoard for the sake of hoarding, and it's never enough, right? And so that's kind of an allegory too, because people can see that same concept in their own lives, and they tell stories to make sense of it. And I think that human beings do that all the time with all kinds of things. We tell stories to try to make sense of things, because we can't quite put our finger on what it is that's bothering us about it, right? It's a really good question. Thank you, Meg.
My next question is, so this book is about good and evil, about the need for kindness and community. There are so many brilliant characters. The Ogress is my favorite. She's so kind, even though you don't expect her to be. What character did you enjoy making the most?
Well, I really liked writing the ogress. I really liked writing the crows, who are annoyed with the ogress, right? She keeps on giving, even though from what they perceive to people who don't deserve it, right? And they say, "What is the matter with you?" Right? And she says, "No, you don't understand. It still is important to give. It still is important to give kindness. It still is important to be generous, right?" I think that's hard for us to learn. I think that's hard for us to know. This idea of deservedness is a fallacy, right? There's no such thing as deservedness. The sun does not care if you are a good person or a wicked person. The sun shines on both of us the same. Right? So too are we supposed to be generous with everybody. That means that everybody is our neighbor, even the people that we don't like so much. That person is still our neighbor. That's hard. The other thing that I really liked, so in a lot of ways in that interaction, the crows are kind of the stand-in for the rest of us, because I think most of us feel that way. We only want the good people to get the good things. And so the ogress is there to say, no, that's not how it works, right? Goodness is for everyone. We just have to be generous. And the other thing that I really liked writing was the orphans, the kids. I am the oldest of 5 children in my family. My mom did a lot of childcare for my cousins. I have 26 cousins on my dad's side and 18 cousins on my mom's side. And so there were always a lot of kids in my house. And one of the cool things about growing up in a big family is that there's this sort of gravitation to all of the kids. Like it's like this knot of motion and counter motion, and that you're constantly in relationship with everybody else. I wanted to get that sense of that each of the kids are their own individual people, but as a group they come together and become this kind of almost like a solar system, and that each one has that pull with everybody else, which is why if one is removed, the entire system gets out of whack. And I was thinking about that a lot, and thinking about what it felt like to be in a big family. And so that was really fun to write, to have each of those individual kids come out as their own, but also to see how that alters when they're in the sort of gravitational pull of the people that they love so much. So.
Oh, it was just beautiful. And when one of the orphans, of course, goes missing, and that bit where they didn't know what to do, did they? It was just, it all crumbled. And I just thought it was so beautifully done. I'm one of 4. I'm the eldest of 4. So I exactly, it just brought back memories. And there's so much love, and that really comes through.
Yeah, and annoyance too, right? Poor Elijah, he's always right about everything, but nobody listens to him.
Brilliant.
Enough,
Okay.
Elijah. So, I mean, but that's the thing, right? Like that's what it's like
It
being in a
is.
big
It
family.
is.
So
It's
that was fun.
crazy.
My next question is, the mayor is so evil. He's so selfish and greedy. Did anyone give you inspiration for him?
That's a really good question. I mean, so that's a tough one for me to answer because, I mean, obviously there are all kinds of parallels between him and the person who used to be the president of the United States when I was writing this, which was Donald Trump. But the thing is that it isn't really about him because this whole idea of a strongman shows up again and again and again in history, right? We have seen this before. We have seen somebody who rules by charisma and selfishness and bullying too, kind of. And we have seen this show up before. Back in the 30s, the 1930s, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady, she was married to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She wrote in a letter that she was so worried that what she called European-style fascism could come to America, that all of the conditions were there. In 1932, I think, Sinclair Lewis wrote a book called "It Could Happen Here," which was all about this like brash, rude, brazen, like but super charismatic guy became president of the United States and turned America into a fascist authoritarian state, kind of like that. We are seeing that rise of the strongman all over the place in different countries in Eastern Europe as well as in other places too. We see that same yearning for like strongman politics here in America. I think probably you've seen it in your country too, and we're gonna see it again. Right. So, so for sure, because I wrote this while Trump was president, like he did loom large. So that I heard some, anyway, I mean, he did. There's no question about that. But it isn't him. It's all the guys that are like him, right?
Yeah.
Who've been around, who are around, and are gonna come back. So I think that that's why stories like this are useful because it helps us to sort of recognize it when we see it, right? There were a lot of references to "It Could Happen Here," even though that book was, many, many decades old. So that's a really good question, though. Thank you.
There are so many storytellers in this book. Bartleby and Elijah love telling stories, and there is, of course, the narrator who tells us all the way through listen, and I did. Elijah says he's a good storyteller because he's a good listener. Do you think that is how you became a good storyteller?
That is such a perceptive question. That's a really good question. I do think that storytelling starts with listening. I do actually think that very, very much. So when I was a little kid, I was a delayed reader. I read way after my peers. I had both of my mother is a teacher, my father's as a lawyer. They're both retired now, but I have all kinds of professors and stuff like that in my family. It's a big reading family, and I was very good in education because I became a teacher too when I grew up. In education, we call it learned reading behaviors. I was very good at that. I was really good at knowing that I should be sitting quietly and turning the pages, but my brain wasn't really ready for it. It's fine. Once I became a reader, I was a reader in a big way. Not everybody reads at the same time, but because of that, I was a listener, and I loved stories out loud. I loved stories out loud so much. My dad would read to us every day. He read all of C.S. Lewis to us. He read all of Grimm's fairy tales. He read Dickens to us. He read Robert Louis Stevenson to us. He read like old westerns like Louis L'Amour and books like that. He just read everything to us. I loved the experience of a story out loud. And I love telling stories too. And so when I did become a reader, I really gravitated towards fairy tales as a result. There was that sort of out loud quality to them that I really enjoyed. But I do think, for me, whenever I start a book, I have to think about it for a long time. I always have a box that I will sort of like store notes in, where it's a place for my thoughts to live. I don't actually use anything in it, but it's sort of like it's sort of this very sort of tactile, process-oriented thing. And I'll write sentences that please me, paragraphs that please me. But I do a lot of what I call listening to my characters. Uh, and that I ask them questions and I respond in their voices and I just try to listen to them and try to like observe them. So I do think that, and then also, when I was a kid, I would ride the city bus and my favorite thing was just to listen to people's conversations and then I would try to figure out what that person's story was. So I do think that all story starts with listening. I do. Nobody has asked me that yet, Frankie. This is a great question. So thank you. Do you have any other questions for me, hun?
Yeah, I have lots.
Oh, good.
So my next question is, animals play an important role in the book. The cats and the crows. I wish I could speak crow. Do you?
I always wish that. I have wished that for years. I love crows. They are so cool. If you start researching crows, you will never stop. Want to know a cool thing about crows? I'll tell you a cool thing about crows. So, once upon a time, people thought that humans were the only animals that knew how to make tools. Well, very quickly, good old Jane Goodall proved that was wrong because it turns out that orangutans, not orangutans, but chimpanzees use tools. And then it turns out a bunch of animals use tools. It's just that nobody actually noticed them using tools. Octopuses use tools. Several primates use tools. Lots and lots and lots of animals use tools. But so we're not quite as special as we thought. However, there is something called the hooked tool. This requires a lot of planning and cognition and understanding how a thing is going to work in several steps ahead. So learning how to turn something into a hook and then learning how to use that hook is really, really specific and extremely advanced. There are only two animals that can do that. One are humans, and the other are crows. So that's super cool. And it is also true that crows remember and generationally remember who has been kind to them, and they also remember who is their enemy, and they remember through generations. That's amazing. But so we get a lot of migratory crows here, and they come in just these great crowds, and we have a lot of deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the fall, and so we see them in the early fall, after the leaves are all gone, actually the late fall, before the winter really comes, and then we see them in the early spring before the leaves come back. And to see like a whole grove of oak trees look so cool without their leaves. And to see every teeny branch has like 4 or 5 crows on it, so cool. It's just so amazing, and then they kind of undulate and move around. I mean, the fact is, animals are really cool. I was a park ranger for a little while in my youth, and in a really cool park called Olympic National Park. My ranger station was a 30-mile hike to get to, and there was a herd of elk that was right there. I came face to face with a mountain lion. There are bear all over the place, and marmots. Oh, marmots are so cute, and they would whistle to each other. So cute. And so I love observing animals so much. Where I live right now in Minneapolis, I live in the city, but there's a park and a creek, and lots of trees behind me. So I will see coyote and fox, and once I saw a deer and bald eagle and red-tail hawk, all kinds of stuff. And bunnies. Oh gosh, so many bunnies. So I really like just sitting out in my back patio and just watching the animals. It's really fun for me. So anyway,
So my next question is, I learnt lots of new words reading this book, like cacophony and
uh-huh,
discombobulated
uh-huh.
are two of them. I really like the sound of them both. Do you have a favorite word?
I love the word cacophony so much because it kind of describes my household most days. Um, and so where I live, so my block is a dead end street. It dead ends right into like the park and the creek and stuff. And there are 34 kids on my block. And so there's just always a lot of activity out in front of my house. Kids playing stickball and other stuff like that. Or, boys with no shirts on all the time, even in the winter. Ugh, I don't know how they do it. But there are my son is 17, and so there's 5 boys on the block that are all his exact same age, and they've all grown up together, and they take up a lot of space, and so there's a lot of cacophony in my home. But I'll tell you what my favorite word, my absolutely favorite word is perspicacious. It's my absolutely favorite word. And just judging by your questions, Frankie, I would call you a perspicacious young lady, actually.
Thank you. So my next question is, you share a message in the Ogress and the Orphans about the power of books. You
Mhm.
write the ideas and knowledge contained inside their pages have mass and velocity and gravity. They bend both space and time. They have minds of their own. There is a power in a book that surpasses even that of a dragon. What do books mean to you?
Well, all of those things for one. And when I was a little girl, I experienced a lot of bullying when I was a little girl, and so when I did come to books, when did learn find books. Books were really a safe haven for me. I was always safe when I read a book. I was always safe in the library. We had a really awesome librarian in my school. Oh, she was so great. And I still remember what that library smells like, even all these years later. Isn't that funny? But I do think that there's this wonderful book that is for grown-ups, not for children, but I think about it a lot, called Gould's Book of Fish. It's kind of a devastating book in a lot of ways, but there is this line at the beginning about the power of books that when we are reading, we are more than ourselves. And that we are people with souls. And one of the things that I like about reading, and I used to teach reading, and I taught literature, and back when I used to be a teacher. And one of the things that I would tell my students then was that reading a book was an act of what I called radical empathy, right? That when we read, we see as another sees, we hear as another hears, we feel as another feels, and we know what another knows. So we get to fully inhabit the mind and body and perspective of somebody who is not us, and that is a really important skill, but also experience, right? But the other thing that I would tell my students is that, it's a bunch of things I told them. I told them that that the writer does not build the story, and I do believe that the reader builds the story, and the story happens in that space between the reader and the page, right? It's not on the page; it's here, right? But the other thing I told them was that a book wasn't just a book. A book is a conversation. And it's a conversation between the writer and the reader. It's a conversation between the beginning and the end, and then back to the beginning again. It's a conversation between this book and other books, and it's a conversation between the book and the world. And so I think that, there are very few other objects in the world that have that kind of expansiveness, right? That are able to be that many different things. Refuge, another person, like the giant world, all of those things are in this little rectangle that doesn't even move. You know what I mean? That's kind of amazing, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
It does seem like it spans both time and space.
Love it.
So my next question is based on a lot of things that you've already said. So I read on your website that you are a former teacher, bartender, waitress, activist, park ranger, secretary, janitor, and a church guitar player. And now you're an author. What's your favorite job?
Whoa, that's a really good question. Well, I mean, what we can learn from my list of jobs is that I got fired a lot and that I don't really have any marketable skills except for this. So I'm glad that people allow me to do it because it helps me to pay the bills. But I do think, one of the things that I love, I love being a teacher. I really did. And if we didn't have, budget cuts and layoffs, I probably would still be a teacher today. I mean, honestly, it's true. And I I once got all 120 of my 7th graders to refer to me as Princess Barnhill for a whole year. Awesome. It was so awesome. So things like I really did like being a teacher. I didn't like the meetings. I didn't like the politics. I didn't like the sort of like, the uppity ups changing things for us all the time. I didn't like any of that. So maybe I wouldn't have stayed after all. I don't know. But I love being a teacher. I love being a writer. I love it so much. Writing is really hard. I don't always love writing, but I really love being able to come into classrooms and talk to kids about books and stories and ideas. I love encouraging kids to write stories of their own. And to connect themselves to this practice of story, because this is a really ancient practice. It's our most ancient things. We've been telling stories since before we even had language. That's so amazing to me.
Yeah.
And that this is truly our birthright. As human beings, is to engage in story. So I like that part of my job. But also, every one of my books comes from this place of deep love and care. And I truly love my characters. I truly love my readers. I truly want everyone to be okay and safe and happy. And so I always cry when I have to turn the book in because it doesn't belong to me anymore. So that sense of connection and care is a through line for me in my work, and I do like that a lot.
Oh, that's amazing. I would love it if you would share with us a bit of a reading from the book, please.
I would
Kelly.
love. I'm just going to the very beginning. First of all, so I have a different cover than you. This is the cover in America, and what I like about it is that the ogress is too big to fit on one side. Also, I said my only rule is that there has to be a crow somewhere. So, and there's way more crows on your guys' copy. But the crow Harold, is named after my nephew, Harold. Oh, there. Yeah, see, I love that cover too.
Yeah, it's
They do a really good
gorgeous.
job. I love the shine and the letters.
Yeah, the sheen, it's just, you just want to stroke it.
It's really very nice. Anyway, so Harold is named after my nephew Harold, who is 5 and in
Oh,
kindergarten. I love him so much. Okay, chapter 1. Pay attention. Listen. This is a story about an ogress. She is not who you might think she is. But really, is anyone? The ogress lived in a crooked house at the far edge of town. She enjoyed baking and gardening and counting the stars. Like all ogres, the ogress was quite tall. Even sizable adults would have to crane their necks a bit and squint to say hello. She had feet the size of tortoises, hands the size of heron's wings, and a broad, broad brow that cracked and creased when she concentrated. Her skin was like granite, and her eyes looked like brand new pennies. Her hair sprouted and waved from her head like prairie grass, stiff and yellow and green, and sometimes spangled with daisies or dandelions or creeping ivy. Like all ogres, she spoke little and thought much. She was careful and considerate. Her heavy feet trod lightly on the ground. This is also a story about a family of orphans. There were 15 orphans living in the orphan house at the time our story begins, several years after the ogress first arrived in town. There were too many children for one house, but they made do. Their names were Anthea, Bartleby, Cassandra, who preferred to be called Cass, Deirdre, Elijah, Fortunate, Gratitude, Hiram, Iggy, Justina, Kai, Lily, Maud, and the babies, Nanette and Orpheus. They were good children, these orphans, studious and hardworking and kind, and they loved one another dearly, ever so much more than they loved themselves. The ogress, too, was hardworking and kind and generous. She also loved others more than she loved herself. This can be a problem, of course, sometimes, but it can also be a solution. Let me show you how.
oh, that was amazing. Thank you. Really lovely. I loved that Frankie got the book out there and was reading the words as you were, as she was it. Really nice. So I think Frankie just has one more question for you, Kelly, if you don't mind.
So my last question is, are you working on a book now? If so, what is it about?
That's a really good question. So I'm actually working on 3 right now, but it's very slowly because right now I suffered a concussion right before Christmas, and I still am not the same right now. So everything is taking me a little bit longer than before, but I am getting better. So I'm working on 3 books right now. One is called The Sugar House, which I think will be the next one to come out. And it's a retelling of the Hansel and Gretel story with a little goodly dollop of the Mother Hulda or / Mother Frost stories thrown in. But it's set in South Minneapolis in the present day, where I live. So it's a Hansel and Gretel story in which the diabetic kid saves the day. But nobody will believe him because he accidentally almost blew up the school. Not really, but that's just how it played out in the media. And so it's about this kid who, like, no matter what he does, people see him through the lens that he's a bad kid. And they see him as a bad kid in kind of an outlandish way. Ever since he was in 2nd grade, the principal has had him on his list. And whatever he does, like, people assume the very, very worst of him, and they think he's a bad kid. But the thing is, He's not a bad kid. He's a really good kid. He really loves his little brother. He really loves his dad. He really loves his two uncles who live with them. He really loves them so much. He loves his best friend, Hannah. He loves them so much. He just makes some really stupid choices sometimes. And sometimes those stupid choices have really like big consequences. And one time he makes a stupid choice that has such a big consequence that it lands him in juvie, which is what we call kid jail in America. And not for very long, but like he's got, social workers coming over and has made his dad's life that much harder. But then something really scary moves into the neighborhood. And this like abandoned house becomes like incredibly beautiful with all kinds of treats and wonderful things coming out of it. And this very beautiful woman named Miss Lacey, who everybody loves so much, but it rubs Nate the wrong way, and everything about it rubs him the wrong way. And suddenly kids in the neighborhood are starting to disappear. And then that becomes the question of the story. If he is going to do something about this, if he is going to try to stop this scary thing that is sort of like getting to becoming like more and more and more of a problem, no matter what he does, people are going to see his actions through the lens that he's a bad boy, that he's a bad kid. And whatever he does is almost definitely gonna land him back in juvie. So how do you be brave then, right? So that's that book. I'm also working on another book called Dispatch from the Hideous Laboratories of Dr. Otto van Drecht that has a ex-pirate and a thwarted mathematician and a possibly evil alchemist. So that is the other one that I'm working on as well. So it's no rest for the weary.
They sound fabulous. I love it. Kelly, it has been such an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Frankie, for your brilliant questions.
Welcome.
Frankie, you were amazing. Just amazing. Thank you so much. Your questions were
Listen, we've been having a beautiful chat today with the great Kelly Barnhill about this fabulous book, which you must read. It's The Ogress and The Orphans. It's by Piccadilly Press, and it's out now. Thank you so much for joining us at the Love Reading Lit Fest. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.